you for the opportunities you give us to gather together in your name and to study your word. I pray that this lesson will be edifying for you and that it will be beneficial to your work. So, Zan, pray, amen. We good? Okay. Well, we're getting towards the end. Maybe 2 more weeks of 1 Samuel. So, we're almost there. We're finishing up the kind of decline, fall of Saul. As we've gone over a few times, we can break up Saul's reign into about 3 periods. You've got the early reign, which goes from about chapter 9 through 14, and then you've got his middle reign, where he's slowly becoming more paranoid. We see the rise of David and his frustration with David, his rivalry with David. That goes from about 15 to 19. And then we have the last part of his reign where he's just gone completely off his rocker, just completely crazy. And that's going to be 20 through to the end. And we're getting towards the end of his third phase. Last time we did what I couldn't help myself. I like the title too much. The Tale or a Story of Two Fools, which is David and Nabal. Right? We've got Nabal, who is obviously the idiot, who's not willing to help David. But we also got David, who's acting a little brashly. He's frustrated with Nabal. He's frustrated probably with Saul as well, and he gets himself into a bit of a trouble. And ultimately, it is Abigail, Nabal's wife, who is able to talk some sense into David, and he ends up not killing Nabal, even if he deserved it, which would have been bad, especially since David's supposed to be the hero of Israel. Now, the story ends with what should be a fairly positive note, right? Nabal is dead. He receives divine judgment. David doesn't kill him. He wanted to, but he didn't. And that frees up Abigail. Abigail is now a very wealthy widow. And it just so happens that David's in the market for a wealthy widow. So they end up getting married. And this seems like a really happy end to the story. However, David gets another happy ending. He gets a second wife on top of Abigail. And in future lists, which just to completely throw a wrench in this story, in future lists, this second wife, Ahinoam, is usually listed first, which a lot of commentaries assume means he might already be married to Ahinoam. We're just not told about her yet, which raises some interesting questions about his relationship with Abigail and marriage to Abigail. It's like, did he not tell Abigail about her? And so on. And of course, this raises interesting question about David now having multiple wives, because this ultimately will be one of his big weaknesses is with women. So what should be a fairly happy ending to a tumultuous story ends on a very kind of foreboding ending, which is he's multiplying wives, which he shouldn't be doing. I didn't have a slide for it, but it goes back to the law of the king, right? Kings of Israel are supposed to not do 3 things. You don't multiply horses, you don't multiply gold, and you don't multiply wives. And David's not even king yet, he's already multiplying wives. Saul, interestingly enough, for all of his faults, doesn't appear to multiply wives. I was like, if he has one good quality, it seems to be that he was pretty good about that. But David doesn't just have 2 women in his life right now. He's actually got a third because we kind of forget about Michal. She's still in Gibeah or wherever she is. So David should have a third wife. So there's technically 3 running around. For most men, 1's good enough, but David now has 3. And this chapter, the story ends in, I think, a really sad way, which is Michal has moved on to another suitor. It's curious that this comes at the very end of the story. Was she holding out? Was she hoping that David would come back for her and he's just not able to? Did he forget about her? Has Saul been pressuring her? I mean, we just don't know. But it is curious that we're told after these 2 new wives that she's now been forced or pressured or whatever has moved on. This is, of course, increasingly sad because she's the one that the Bible actually tells us loved David. She's the one who orchestrated his escape when Saul first tried to kill him. She's the one who's She was the one willing to lie to Saul to cover up for David. She went to a lot of extremes, even putting herself at risk to protect her husband, and for whatever reason, they've now been separated, and she's moved on to a new husband, which I see Michal as a really tragic character. But with all that said, we're moving on to another fairly positive moment in David's life, which is the second time he spares Saul's life. We already had the first one, right, where they're hiding in the cave and Saul is relieving himself, and David then cuts off a corner of his robe to humiliate Saul and then ends up apologizing for it. So this time we're going to get a similar type situation. So beginning in verse 1 of chapter 26, then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah. So backing up a little bit, in chapter 23, we should already know that after David had been on the run for a while, right? He went to Ramah to get help from Samuel. That didn't pan out. He went to Nob to get help with the priests, and he got a little help, but he was run off because of Saul's servants were lurking in the shadows. Then he goes to Gath, which was a mistake. Then he goes to Moab, which was a mistake, ultimately ending up in the forests around Keilah. And then he saves the city, and then he's forced to leave because the residents are going to turn him over to Saul. So Saul is now on the run, right? Or David's on the run, Saul is closing in, and they enter into this sort of cat and mouse where David is heading towards the wilderness of Ziph. Then he keeps moving eastward towards the Jeshimon region. Ultimately, he'll end up in En-Gedi, and Saul is just trailing them all the whole time. And then, in the previous chapter, he ends up heading south for some reason. We're not really told why he goes south. But then he comes back north and ends up in Maon, where he has his altercation with Nabal. So he's been all over the place. But now we're told about the Ziphites, right? So presumably the residents of Ziph, that's that orange area. The Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah saying, David is hiding on the hill of Hachilah opposite Jeshimon. So going back to this map, Jeshimon is the region, the wilderness area roughly west of En-Gedi. So we know where that is. As far as I can tell, we have no idea where Hachilah is. But it's presumably somewhere in Jeshimon. So that narrows it down a bit. So he is most likely somewhere east of Ziph. So he was in Maon. That's where he had his altercation with Nabal. That's where he ends up marrying Abigail. And because he couldn't stay there for whatever reason, maybe he was afraid the residents would turn him in or whatever, he ends up heading back north into the wilderness. And the residents of Ziph have heard rumors or there have been sightings of David back in this wilderness area. And what do? They go running to Saul. So this morning I was... a friend of a friend was co-teaching a Sunday school class, and he asked if I'd fill in for him because he's been sick. And so I've been giving him highlights from Samuel, and we redid chapter 22. And we get to the end where he's defending Keilah. And the issue came up that David's worried that the residents are going to turn him over to Saul. And so he asks the Lord, are they going to turn me over if I stay? And the Lord goes, yeah, they will. So David has to leave. And one of the people at the end made a question, which is, he's supposed to ask a question, but he made a statement, which was that, well, the residents didn't actually turn him over. God just said that to get him motivated or to move. And it's like, I think they were going to do it. The priests seemed to confirm that the residents were going to do it and that Yahweh told them the residents were going to do it. So I don't doubt that the residents would have turned him in. And we know right here that the Ziphites, who David has no connection with, but they're willing to do it. So if the Ziphites are going to turn him in, why would we assume that other cities wouldn't turn him in as well if they had the opportunity? If they're either aligned with Saul or they think that they'll get a reward if they turn him in, or it could be that they've bought into the propaganda that David is just some traitor, rebel, outlaw, bandit, and they see David as the enemy. I mean, it's possible that some cities don't see David as the hero. We know that there are others that do, but it's possible some don't. They've kind of bought into the Saul narrative. So for whatever reason, these residents are willing to sell out David. So then in verse 2, Saul, accompanied by 3,000 of the choice men of Israel, went to the wilderness of Ziph to search for David there. Saul camped beside the road at the hill of Hakilah, opposite Jeshimon. David was living in the wilderness and discovered Saul had come there after him. So he's been told roughly where David is. Again, I think it's safe to say somewhere in the green area. He's got 3,000 men. That seems a bit overkill, but he's going to get David. A fair question might be, what happened to the covenant? Because if we go back to chapter 24, after the first time David spared Saul's life, right? They're in the cave, Saul's relieving himself. We'll leave it at that. And David humiliates him by cutting off a piece of his robe, and then he shows it to Saul and like, I could have killed you if I wanted to, but I don't want to kill you. And in the end, at the end of the chapter, now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Therefore, swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David swore to Saul. Then Saul went back home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. It seems like Saul is calling a truce. I won't kill you. I won't wipe out your family as long as you continue not to kill me or wipe out my family. And David seems to agree to this. And for whatever reason, Saul has conveniently forgot, or he's just so crazy he's not going to honor it, or whatever, but Saul has clearly broken the truce. David, when the civil war happens, will also kind of break the truce. But to be fair, Saul did it first. So it is a tragedy that kind of both parties end up not honoring this commitment. But Saul did it first. That's a fair point. I was like, I don't know why. Did Saul mean it when he made, was he just saying whatever he had to say to get David to leave? Did he mean it at the time, but now he's intentionally breaking the promise? Has he forgotten? Has he gone so crazy he doesn't remember? We don't know. All we know is a little time has passed and Saul's back to wanting to kill David. We just don't know much more than that. Verse 4. So David sent out spies and knew for certain that Saul had come. Immediately David went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw the place where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the general of his army, were lying down. Saul was lying inside the inner circle of the camp with the troops camped around him. So Saul is camped nearby. He's got his 3,000 men. They've established some sort of military perimeter. He's in the center, which is ideal, right? Because you're the king. You want to be protected. If you play chess, right, one of the things you do is you castle your king so that your king's all nice and protected with his troops and everything. We do get a mention of Abner. If we remember, Abner, we believe, is Saul's uncle, which, to be fair, Saul's getting up there at this point. He's probably, honestly, he's got to be in his 50s, maybe pushing 60, and if Abner's his uncle, Abner's got to be up there too, even if he's a younger uncle. Seems like he would be, 70, but he's a great general, he's a great military leader, and he's still obviously serving Saul, but it is interesting. Verse 6. Then David asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, who will go with me into the camp to Saul? I'll go with you, answered Abishai. So, this is crazy, right? The Saul is camped with his 3,000 men just right there on the hill or whatever, and David's just going to walk into the camp. That seems to be the plan. And so he asks, now, this is the first reference we get to Joab. Joab will be the main general under David when he becomes king. And Joab, we don't talk about Joab enough. Joab is a thug. Abner is a military genius. Abner is kind of brash and a harsh man, but he knows what he's doing. Joab he's the guy that gets things done. And he even gets himself into a little trouble because David has these moments where he'll be like, who will rid me of whatever, and Joab will do it. You put an idea in Joab's head, and he is a man who gets things done. But he's also not afraid to bloody his hands, not afraid to do dirty work, not afraid to, he's not an honorable man. But again, he's the kind of guy that if you're going to war, you want Joab on your side because he will win at any cost. That's the kind of guy he is. But Joab, who becomes a rather major character, especially in 2 Samuel, we're not introduced to him yet, but he's an important enough figure that we're giving kind of a tease. We're introduced to his brother. But again, Joab becomes a really important figure. I don't know, I have this weird obsession with Joab. I always have an obsession with Joab. He's just such an interesting figure. And he's not a very nice person, but he is interesting. So David has, presumably these are two of his maybe top commanders or top military leaders. Since we have a reference to Joab, Joab might already be kind of rising through the ranks. Again, he's obviously important enough that he gets a mention here. But he's asking these two guys, are either of you willing to go with me into the camp? And Joab's brother is willing to do it. So we know Joab is crazy. Joab, if he was there, presumably if he was there, he would have gone with David. But his brother is just as loyal and about just as reckless. So verse 7, that night, David and Abishai came to the troops, and Saul was lying there asleep in the inner circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. Abner and the troops were lying around him. We don't get much other context. How did David get through? Was there a perimeter? Were there guards? Was there some sort of fence? Did David bribe the guards? Did the guards know David and they just let him in? Does he have, his own men inside Saul's army? Saul's already paranoid. He's already accused some of his men of not actually being loyal to him. We just don't know. But all of a sudden, David is here in the middle of the camp, surrounded by 3,000, presumably, enemy combatants. And there's Saul right there on the ground. Verse 8. Then Abishai said to David, "Today God has handed your enemy over to you. Let me thrust the spear through him into the ground just once. I won't have to strike twice." And that's a thing to say. My dad always liked the Russian saying, the Russian proverb. I've never heard anyone else say it, but he always said it was a Russian proverb. The hammer that strikes hardest need not strike again. And here's Abishai. Like, you give me one good thrust, and that's it. Again, we know Joab is crazy, so I don't think it's too far to assume Abishai is almost as crazy as Joab. And then in verse 9, but David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him, for who can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and be blameless?" So again, we're going to get one of the more righteous moments of David, which is he doesn't want to kill Saul. He knows it's wrong. He knows he doesn't have the right to kill Saul. He doesn't have the right to judge Saul. And I'm sure, I don't know. It's just, did he not tell Abishai what the plan was? Did he not warn Abishai, we're not going to kill Saul? Did Abishai just go along assuming that was the plan and David didn't clarify? I mean, this could have gone really bad very quickly if he hadn't stopped him, unless he told Abishai, we're not going to kill Saul, and Abishai just doesn't care because he wants to kill Saul anyway. If Joab had been there, he might have killed Saul anyway, because that's just the kind of guy he is, right? He's loyal to a fault, and he's a bulldozer when you need a little finesse. And he's willing to do the dirty work even if David says no. I mean, if Joab is the kind of guy, if he was there and David said don't kill him, he'd have killed him anyway. He's like, he needs to die. So it's probably a good thing that he didn't have Joab with him at this moment. But Abishai at least holds off. As mentioned before, the anointed can apply to priests, can apply to prophets, can apply to kings. And the general sentiment across the ancient world is there are certain figures who are appointed by the gods, and you just don't touch them. You don't kill them. Priests, prophets, kings. And the idea is these are individuals who have been selected for service to the gods, and if you do anything to them, that would logically anger the gods, and you don't want that. So you don't want to go and recklessly, you'll go around killing priests because their God's not going to take very kindly to that. And the same is true of kings, because kings rule on behalf of the gods, right? Divine mandate. And if you kill the king, well, that's like being disrespectful to the god, because the god put the king on the throne. So when David says, you don't go around killing the anointed, that's generally true. Now, to be fair, there are times when, yes, you will kill them. For example, if you're killing enemy priests or enemy prophets, or even if a king kills another king in battle, there are times when it might be appropriate. But in this case, we have a very interesting scenario, right? Because we have Saul, who's the anointed of Yahweh, and we have David, who's the anointed of Yahweh. And if there was one individual who has the authority to judge Saul at this point, it would be David. But even David recognizes, I don't have that right. Only God can judge him, which is what he's going to say. So in verse 10, David added, as the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. Either his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Instead, take the spear and the water jug by his head, and let's go. So yeah, David realizes or recognizes he does not have the right to judge Saul here, as much as he probably wants to or feels like he should. It's also interesting that he makes this reference that he has absolute faith that Saul is going to meet his end, right? He's going to either just drop dead or he's going to die in battle. This may be a revelation because he saw that happen, right? He saw it happen with Nabal. He wanted to judge Nabal. He felt like he had a right to judge Nabal. He didn't. He shouldn't, because as the hero of Israel, he shouldn't go around killing anyone who offends him. That's kind of the trouble that Gideon got into. But Abigail tells him, don't do this because you're the hero. You heroes shouldn't act this way. And David repents. He realizes, yes, you're right, I shouldn't do this. But he saw, the judgment of God played out in real time. He actually saw Nabal, or he heard that Nabal just drops dead, because God judged him. So if God is willing to judge Nabal in his time, then he'll judge Saul. And he just needs to just needs to accept that and respect that God will do it in his time. Would David have been as understanding this go around if he hadn't seen Nabal drop dead or hadn't witnessed Nabal dropping dead? I don't know. Would he have been so upset, so hurt that Saul broke the covenant that he would have gotten revenge? I don't know. He was pretty worked up over the Nabal situation. He was pretty worked up. He was willing to kill and willing to exact revenge, but it seems like that experience has changed him again. He's back to being a little more merciful, back to being a little more understanding, and willing to just trust that God will handle everything. So yeah, this is David in a good spot right now. Verse 12, so David took the spear and the water jug by Saul's head, and they went their way. No one saw them, no one knew, and no one woke up. They all remained asleep because a deep sleep from the Lord came over them. So he takes the spear, he takes the jug. We do get the little addition that this was by divine design, that this isn't just David sneaking in, that otherwise someone would have seen, there would have been guards or whatever. So something supernatural has taken place, otherwise we couldn't explain this. Now, how much of this was planned? It's possible that he could have talked to Abiathar, because we know he has a priest with him, and God just told him, go into the camp and do what you need to do. We're not told that in the story, but it's possible that there were other ways that David could have been told, or it could have been revealed to him that this is what happened, and he just trusted God. He just walked into the enemy camp. Not many people would do that, right? But David will do it because, he trusts God. He faced the giant, and he didn't kill Nabal, which was good. He shouldn't kill Nabal. So verse 13, David crossed to the other side and stood on top of the mountain at the distance. There was a considerable space between them. Then David shouted to the troops and to Abner, son of Ner, aren't you going to answer, Abner? Who are you who calls to the king, Abner asked. So they're in the eastern wilderness, not too far from the Dead Sea. There are hills everywhere. So David has crossed some sort of valley. He's on another hill, and he's just shouting from one hill to the other. Your voice can travel. So this isn't completely improbable or impossible. So David has got enough distance that he can, yell and not be too concerned that they'll get to him. So at this point, he's just going to taunt them. Right? He kind of already did this in the first case, where Saul left the cave, and then he's kind of yelling at Saul from the cave, showing off that he had the piece of the cloak. But in verse 15, David called Abner, you're a man, aren't you? Who in Israel is your equal? So why did you protect your lord the king when no one of the people came to destroy him? What you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, all of you deserve to die since you didn't protect your Lord, the Lord's anointed. Now look around. Where are the king's spear and water jug? They were by his head. So David's having some fun, right? And David, we know, can be a bit of a trash talker. We saw this particularly back with Goliath, right? They're exchanging curses, and David enjoys that in his own way. So here he's just goading Abner, right? He's like, whoa, how, you're supposed to be this great general, supposed to be this great military leader. You're supposed to, you're the one in charge of protecting Saul, your nephew, and yet you let someone just walk into camp and get close to the king. Generally speaking, if you're guarding the king and you let an enemy come to the king, that's a pretty major mistake, and the guards would probably be executed. Sorry? Oh, yeah, well, David's mocking him, yeah. But he is bringing up, you failed. Right. But, he's bringing up that this is a failure on a massive level. You're right, he is mocking him. So in verse 17, Saul recognized David's voice and asked, "Is that your voice, my son David?" "It is my voice, my lord and king," David said. Then he continued, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? What evil is in my hand?" It is interesting that here again we have, because if we think of when Saul is in his deranged mode, he doesn't call David by his name. This is something a lot of commentaries and other learned scholars have pointed out, that when he's really mad, he's just kind of going crazy, he always refers to him as Jesse's son. But it seems like when there's moments of clarity, he'll call him by his first name. So here it seems like maybe Saul has had some moment of clarity, or he's come to his senses to some extent, and he's willing to call David by his name. And David asks the question that he's asked before, which is, what have I really done to deserve this? What have I done to deserve this sort of massive manhunt and so on? And fair enough, right? He hasn't actually done anything against Saul. He hasn't really confronted Saul. He hasn't challenged Saul. David really hasn't done anything, especially to deserve this sort of treatment. But we've known that all along. Verse 19, "Now may my lord the king please hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. But if it is people, may they be cursed in the presence of the Lord, for today they have driven me away from sharing in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, 'Go and worship other gods.' So don't let my blood fall to the ground far from the Lord's presence, for the king of Israel has come out to search for a flea like one who pursues a partridge in the mountains." This is kind of a roundabout way of saying, how can you justify on a theological level, right, that I've done anything to harm you? He doesn't directly reference sneaking into the tent, but I think we can almost make that connection, that because he's already mocked Abner, but the reality is, if he had really done something wrong, then God wouldn't be on his side. God is clearly protecting David. He's clearly blessing David. David has Abiathar. David has repeatedly escaped Saul, and he has managed to sneak into Saul's camp undetected and sneak out undetected. So it seems like if David was truly in the wrong, then Saul would have caught him by now. There would be some evidence to justify this treatment. But everything seems to point to the opposite, that David hasn't really done anything. And it is interesting here that he seems to bring up as one of his complaints that he's been denied access to the tabernacle, although we already know that Saul's gone and killed all the priests, which is another issue. That's another problem. He's been basically already driven from Israel at least once, possibly twice. And it seems like right here, like this is his complaint right now. It's not just that Saul wants to kill him, but that he's not even he's not as a fugitive, he's not even allowed to go to the tabernacle. He's not allowed to offer the sacrifices. He's being treated not only as a hostile party, but as a heathen, as someone who's not even worthy of being an Israelite or a Yahweh worshiper. One of my earlier lessons, for those of you who remember, is we went through Psalm 23, and I talked about how in the last verse, I know we traditionally translate it as, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, but I don't really take that reading, and I see house of the Lord referring to the tabernacle, that he's longing to go back to the tabernacle. And we know a lot of David's Psalms were written in his early years, And here, he's making the complaint, right? I'm not allowed to go back to the tabernacle. I'm not allowed to go and offer the sacrifices. And I see Psalm 23 as David longing to go back to the presence of the Lord. He has faith that he will, but he's expressing this frustration. So it lines up really well that he could have written it around this time. I just like the idea of Psalm 23 being one of his earlier psalms because it meshes well with some of his other early psalms. And then he goes, you've so much effort, right, for someone as low and as small, as meager as I am. David can be a little bit of a humble braggart. He has a little false humility sometimes where he'll kind of downplay his significance. David's an important guy, and I think he knows that. He's the champion of Israel. He's the anointed one. He's very popular. He's very successful. So he knows he's important, but at the same time, Saul shouldn't be doing this. And and he's already kind of made this point that this effort is not commiserate with what I've done or my situation. So in verse 21, Saul responded, I have sinned. Come back, my son David. I will never harm you again, because today you consider my life precious. I have been a fool. I've committed a grave error. So this reminds me, this may not be the right audience for that, and that's fine. The original Raimi Spider-Man movie, the villain is the Green Goblin, and the villain is insane. He's crazy. But at the end, right before he's about to die, he has this moment where you don't know if he's sane or not. He's kind of pleading with Spider-Man, don't kill me, forgive me, blah, blah, blah. But because the way his madness has progressed throughout the entire film, when you get to this moment, you don't really know if he's sincere or not. And that's kind of how I feel about this verse 21, that Saul has just gone so far off the deep end. He's become so deranged that even here where he seems to be pleading with David, it's hard to know, is this really Saul? Is he having a moment of sincerity? Is he having a moment of honesty? Is he really asking David to forgive him? He calls him David, which seems to suggest maybe he's coming to his senses, but at the same time, we know that you can't really trust Saul, that he's broken his promises before, and he keeps going back into his craziness. So it's hard to know, right? It's hard to know if at this point there is still some sanity left in him, or if he is just so crazy that he's just good at masking it. And again, this is a very tragic story, right? Saul has just a very, very bad end. So in 22, David answered, here is the king's spear. Have one of the young men come over and get it. May the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and his loyalty. I wasn't willing to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord handed you over to me today. Just as I considered your life valuable today, so may the Lord consider my life valuable and rescue me from all trouble. So he's not going back to Saul. He can't trust Saul. But he is willing to give him back the spear as a gesture of goodwill, and it seems like he's willing to just say, I'm going to go my way, you go your way, and let's just avoid each other. That's about as good as Saul's going to get. And it's probably more than Saul deserves, right? In verse 25, Saul said to him, you are blessed, my son David. You will certainly do great things. You will also prevail. Then David went on his way, and Saul returned home. But again, we've already had this kind of ending, right? We already had earlier, the first time David could have killed Saul and didn't, we had this similar sort of reaction where they come to they even made a covenant, right? And they're like, I won't kill you, you don't kill me, which Saul ended up breaking. So it's really hard to take Saul at his word here. It's hard to believe that Saul's really going to change, or that he's going to call off the hunt, or that David can trust him in any capacity whatsoever. Chapter 27, the very next verse. David said to himself, one of these days I'll be swept away by Saul. We don't know how much time has passed. It could be the very next day. It could be that very next moment. But he knows he can't trust Saul. Even though Saul has supposedly returned home, even though Saul has supposedly said, I'm going to call off the hunt, I'm just going to leave you to your devices, David knows he can't rely on Saul's word. So the rest of verse 1, there is nothing better for me than to escape immediately to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will stop searching for me everywhere in Israel, and I'll escape from him. So David's already tried this. He already tried to run away to the Philistines. That did not go over very well. He had to act crazy. And we know that then he goes to Moab, and he's chastised for that. Like, the prophet actually comes to him and says, you don't go to Moab. That's wrong. I think it's safe to say that he was probably wrong to go to Gath. And you get the response. Was he right to act crazy? And my response is, I haven't quite used this line yet, but I've been itching to do it. It's like if you have, I don't know of anyone, I'm not relying on any specific instance, I'm just making an absolute generalization. But it's like you have someone in the church who commits an affair, and then the wife finds out. Oh boy. And then the man goes to the pastor and says, Pastor, my wife found out that I'm sleeping with so-and-so. What would Jesus do in my situation? Well, he wouldn't be in your situation, right? And you shouldn't be in the situation. There's really no good way out of it. So it's like, well, should David have danced, or should David not have danced, or should David have acted crazy, or whatever? And my answer is he shouldn't have been in Gath in the first place. He shouldn't have gone to Gath. He shouldn't have tried to hide out. He certainly shouldn't have tried to hide with the enemy. Like, that was just kind of a boneheaded plan. Now, he's desperate, and I get it. He's not thinking very clearly. And he ends up trying to hide out in Moab, which is as bad, if not worse. So I don't want to be too hard on him, but at the same time, he just shouldn't have been in Gath in the first place. So it's just fun when commentaries kind of argue about whether or not he was right to pretend to be crazy, and I'm thinking, he shouldn't have been in Gath in the first place. Like, that's the issue here, not whether or not he's pretending to be crazy. But in verse 2, so David set out with his 600 men and went to Achish, son of Maoch, the king of Gath. David and his men stayed with Achish in Gath. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives. Two wives, because he lost Michal. Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. See, here we have Ahinoam mentioned first, which is interesting, because we would expect Abigail to be mentioned first. Verse 4, when it was reported to Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. So there's a lot going on right here. There's a lot going on. And we need to pause for a moment and really take in what has just happened. Because David has already tried this. First of all, he tried to go to Gath. That was a mistake. And then he tried to go to Moab and align himself with the Moabites, and he was chastised for it. Like, Gad had to come and say, don't do this. But now, not only has he gone back to Gath, but it appears as though he has now sworn fealty to the king of Gath, which is what he tried to do in Moab, but he was told not to. So why is it that now it's okay? Now it's appropriate? Logically, we need to ask what has changed, because this is a pretty major situation. When he went to Moab, just to put it in the right context, he goes with his family. He's probably got a few men with him, but he is very much on the run. He's very much in a state of desperation. And he's basically throwing himself to the king of Moab, saying, please take care of my family, please give us all kind of amnesty, and I'll just do whatever I need to do to stay in your good graces. And the king of Moab is just rubbing his hands, because he knows that David is a champion, he knows David's a great fighter, he knows that David's a cunning commander, and presumably what he's going to do is going to make David an officer in his army, which will almost certainly require him to fight against Israel. And that's the issue here, that he's going to be forced to fight in the Moabite army against Israel. He's basically becoming a traitor, right? He's going to become the Benedict Arnold of Israel, because that's the only path he sees open to him, which is why Gad has to show up and stop him. Like, you can't do this, right? You can't be the anointed of Yahweh and fight against Israel. Like, that just doesn't work. And he manages to stop, David before he goes down a path that he can't fix. But something's different now that seems to make this at least mildly more appropriate. And I think the answer is David's not alone right now He's certainly not in the position he was when he goes to Moab. David has been acquiring men, especially ever since he defended Keilah. His army is growing, and Saul's is dwindling. David's fame is growing, it's expanding. And David is, again, he's not coming to Gath in the same context that he was before. Like the first time, he's pretty much alone, and he's just trying to hide out, and that was a disaster. He goes to Moab because he's going to be on his knees begging for help. That's not the situation here when it comes to Gath. Right? He's coming as basically the leader of an outlaw bandit. I mean, he's basically got his own mercenary army. It seems like within the context, he's going to strike a very interesting deal with the king of Gath. So it's a completely different scenario, right? With Moab, he's basically on his knees begging for help. But here, he's not so much on his knees begging the king of Gath for help as he wants to strike a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. So I think the context is enough that we need to understand that and appreciate it, because it's still, I think, maybe towing the line a bit, but it seems like this is much more acceptable than what he was doing in the few chapters earlier. So in verse 5, now David said to Achish, "If I have found favor with you, let me be given a place in one of the outlying towns so I can live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" That day Achish gave Ziklag to him, and it still belongs to the kings of Judah today. The time that David stayed in the Philistine territory amounted to 1 year and 4 months. So, right off the bat, he's not living with Achish. He's not going to be living in Gath or one of the major cities. He's not asking for protection from the king of Gath. Instead, he's asking for permission to live in one of the surrounding cities. He wants autonomy, and he wants to be out of the supervision of the king. So he's not enlisting in the Philistine army. He's not going to be taking orders from the king. He's just striking a very interesting deal. And in exchange for the deal, he's going to be given one of the cities that he can kind of run and operate on his own. So he's given some, again, autonomy. So I think this is an important distinction, right? Because with Moab, he probably wouldn't have had that because he was completely on his knees just begging for help, and he would have had to take whatever deal the king of Moab put on him. But here, he's got some leverage. So in verse 8, David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, they had been the inhabitants of the region through Shur as far as the land of Egypt. So what exactly is the deal that he struck? Well, the deal seems to be, we're not completely given all the details, but it seems like we can kind of piece it together, is he's got his band, his mercenary army, right? And David has got a reputation for being a bit of an outlaw, because again, we know that Saul's spreading propaganda, Saul's saying he's a traitor, a turncoat, and whatever, and David can probably leverage that. He can go to the king of Gath and say, "I'm an outlaw. I'm on the outs with Saul. I'm no longer part of Israel. I'm no longer a part of the Israelite army." And the king of Gath has probably heard enough rumors, and he knows that Saul's been looking for him, and Saul's probably called him every horrible name under the sun. So that gives him leverage, right? It gives credibility to David's story that he's no longer a part of Israel. And he's got his merry band of outlaws that probably look like cutthroat pirates because they've been living on the run for so long. And he's willing to kind of put on this sort of charade that he's just this outlaw mercenary bandit who's on the run from Saul. And so, but he doesn't want to join with the Philistines because that would be treason, and he doesn't want to fight against Israel. So the deal he's going to strike is, give me one of your cities that I can go and live with my men, and we'll run it, we'll take care of it. And in exchange, we want one of the border cities, because he wants to be as far away from the Philistines as possible. He doesn't want to be under supervision. He doesn't want to rely on them. He doesn't want them to be digging their noses in what he's doing. And the deal is he's going to protect the frontier. So his men are going to be kind of part of the border patrol, the border guards. It's not a bad deal, right? He's got a city. He's got a place where he can kind of band headquarters for his operations. He's out on the frontier. Saul's not going to find him. He is technically now under the Philistine umbrella. So Saul's not going to go to war with the Philistines right now just to try and flush out David. And David, again, is retaining some autonomy. And this is part of the brilliance. Again, this is one of David's more cunning moments, and it's still kind of a little on the gray area, but it is rather clever. So the deal is that he's going to protect the Philistine border on the south. And presumably there was an understanding about what that would mean. So David is perhaps not being completely truthful about the extent of the protection, as the text is going to tell us. So he's there on the border, right, of Philistia, which is also technically the border of Judah, right there in Ziklag. And he's using that as a base of operations to go and do raids down into Shur. So just to clarify what Shur is, that's the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. So there are all kinds of roving bands, bandits, areas, groups here that have been long-term enemies of Israel. They've been inching their way northward into Judah. They've been harassing their caravans as they go to Egypt, and they've just been a regular nuisance. So David has taken upon himself, in protecting the border, of going after specifically groups that have been against Israel. He's actually protecting Israel's border on the Philistine dime, which is fairly clever, honestly. Again, he's not being completely honest with the Philistines, but we don't care about the Philistines. The Philistines are the enemy, right? So in verse 9, whenever David attacked the land, he did not leave a single person alive, either man or woman, but he took flocks, herds, donkeys, camels, and clothing. Then he came back to Achish, who inquired, "Where did you raid today?" David replied, "The south country of Judah, the south country of the Jerahmeelites, or against the southern country of the Kenites." So this is all really important. So we're just going to have to kind of lump it all together. So David's in Ziklag, which Ziklag is not on my map here, but it's not too far from Gerar, so it's somewhere in that blue area on the map. It seems like the deal that he struck with Achish is that he's going to protect the border. But by border, they mean the southeastern border. Basically, Achish's understanding is he's going to be protecting the Philistine territory from the Judeans. But David's not going to fight the Judeans. He doesn't want to go to war with the Judeans. He's not going to go against the Judean tribes, or particularly groups of people that might be allied with the Judeans. Instead, he's going southwest into the Sinai Peninsula to take on Israel's enemies, because he's using this opportunity to protect Israel's borders and to harass long-standing enemies of Israel. It's possible that these roving bandit tribes or whatever, that these groups are allied with the Philistines, which is why he can't let, so there's two reasons at least, possibly. He can't let Achish know what he's doing, because on the one hand, it's possible that these groups have been allied with the Philistines, in their hatred for Israel. So if anyone's alive, or if he lets men or women get away, they might go to Achish and say, "What have you done? You've let David run amok, and he's killing your allies." You can't have that. But the other issue is, it's possible that even if these tribes aren't allied with the Philistines, it seems like the deal that they struck is that he was going to be protecting the eastern border, and that he would be going into Judah, but he doesn't want to go into Judah. So, but he brings back, goods, camels, and so on, which he then, he gives a certain tribute to Achish, because Achish is technically, over his territory. But he just tells Achish that this is stuff he's gotten in his raids on Judah. We all kind of following what's going on. Whether or not this is morally right, I don't know. It is interesting, and it is rather clever on David's part that he's gotten protection from the Philistines, and he's basically having the Philistines pay him to some extent. They are financing, they're protecting him while he's protecting Israel's border, possibly going against Philistine allies, while at the same time avoiding the Judeans, and he's protecting Judah, right? Because these are enemies of Judah. It's a rather clever arrangement that he's made. Now, if Achish ever found out, that would be really, really bad, which is why David has to make sure that Achish never finds out. And it tells us how long he does this, right? He does this for almost a year and a half, which is rather impressive that he pulled this off for so long. So in verse 11, David did not let a man or woman live to be brought to Gath, for he said, "Or they will inform on us and say, 'This is what David did.' This was David's custom during the whole time he stayed in the Philistine territory. So Achish trusted David, thinking, since he has made himself detestable to his people Israel, he will be my servant forever. Obviously, that's not the case, right? David is not the servant of Achish. But, so here we have the confirmation, right? He can't let men or women live because he can't afford them to go to Achish, go to Gath, and say, David, who you've let protect your southern border, which is kind of funny, he's not doing what you said he's going to do. Right? He's not raiding into Judah. Instead, he's going into the Sinai Peninsula, possibly taking on their allies. At the very least, he's not harassing the Israelites like the understanding would be. And David can't afford to have that. But he's maintained the facade long enough that Achish is convinced, right, that he's a loyal ally now of the Philistines, even though we know that's not true. But I know we're still a little early, but that's probably a good place to stop for today.
Any other questions? Comments? Yeah. All right, let's pray together. Father, thank you for tonight, for James, for, Lord, our study and, God, the insight you've given us. And Father, we pray that as we go out from here tonight, we go out, Lord, seeking to be faithful to you, to honor you, Lord. And we pray you'll be with those who are not able to be here by reason of sickness and other issues, Father, in their lives. We pray you'll touch them and help them. And Father, now we ask these things, praying these things in Jesus' name. Amen.